You were discretion wise. This is a dramatized narrative inspired by true events. Some sections are entirely fictional. Kurt Cobain was in the middle of recording what would become the most iconic album of the 1990s when something inside him snapped. He stopped singing mid-take, looked at his producer with eyes full of frustration, and said 4 words that made everyone in the studio freeze. "This doesn't feel right." What happened in the next 3 minutes would create one of the most legendary moments in rock history. But the real story, the one that explains why Nevermind became the album that killed hair metal, launched grunge into the mainstream, and sold over 30 million copies, begins much earlier, in a dirty apartment where two strangers lived in complete silence, afraid to speak to each other. It was September 1990, and Dave Grohl found himself stranded and penniless. His band Scream had just imploded mid-tour when their bassist suddenly quit. No backup plan, no money, just a phone call to Buzz Osborne from the Melvins, desperately looking for rescue. Buzz had a solution. There was a band that loved Dave's drumming, a band that had even told Buzz they wished he was their drummer. The name of that band was Nirvana. But there was a problem. They were in Olympia, Washington. Dave would have to pack up his entire life and fly north to audition for a band he'd never met, led by a man named Kurt Cobain. Before making the trip, Dave decided to call Kurt and introduce himself. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Get to know each other a bit before the audition. Break the ice. What could go wrong? Dave started telling Kurt a story about a terrible party he and Scream had recently attended. "We picked up some beer after a show and headed to this apartment," Dave explained. "When we got there, only about 20 people were there. Guys on one side, girls on the other. They were total Olympia hot chocolate party. Hello Kitty people," Dave continued, not noticing the silence on the other end of the line. "This girl comes in and sits down and starts playing this totally bad, awful music. And after every song, everyone would clap politely. We were like, let's get out of here." There was a pause. Then, in a flat, casual tone, Kurt replied, "Oh yeah, that's my girlfriend Toby." What a way to break the ice. Kurt had been at that party. He'd watched Scream arrive. These real rocker dudes who looked down on everyone there. "I hated them," Kurt would later recall. "I thought they were assholes. But awkward first impression be damned." Kurt wanted Dave in the band. Kurt and Chris Novoselic drove to SeaTac Airport to pick up Dave. He stayed at Chris and his wife Shelley's home for a few days, and then Nirvana gave him a proper audition. "We knew in 2 minutes that he was the right drummer," Chris would say. "He was a hard hitter. He was really dynamic. He was so bright, so hot, so vital. He rocked. There was just one problem. Nirvana already had a drummer, Dan Peters, a talented musician whose style simply didn't fit the band's evolving sound the way Dave's did." A few days later, during an appearance on a local radio show, Kurt broke the news to the public. "His name is Dave and he's a baby Dale Crover," Kurt said, referring to the Melvins' legendary drummer. Then he acknowledged the uncomfortable situation. "Dan's such a beautiful guy, and such a beautiful drummer. But you can't pass up on an opportunity to play with the drummer of our dreams, which is Dave. He's been the drummer of our dreams for like 2 years. It's a bummer. A big bummer." The newly formed Nirvana began rehearsing in a barn in Tacoma. After living with Chris and Shelley for about a month, Dave moved in with Kurt. This is where things got weird. Dave would describe Kurt's apartment as small, cluttered, dirty, and smelly. He slept on a 5-foot couch in the same room as Kurt's turtle tank. The clicking of the turtle shells against the glass as they tried to escape would keep him up at night. "It just felt so weird," Dave recalls. "There wasn't a lot to do. There was a lot of time just spent sitting in the room, totally silent, reading, or just totally silent, doing nothing, staring at walls, going downtown to see a 99-cent movie, shooting BB guns in the backyard." Dave was still living with Kurt when Kurt broke up with Toby. Yes, the same Toby from the party story. "He was just a wreck," Dave remembers. "Just a mess. I was just tired of not finding the right mate," Kurt would later explain. I'd been looking all my life. I've always been old-fashioned in that respect. I've always wanted a girlfriend I could have a good relationship with for a long time. The van rides to Tacoma for band practice, which had already been quiet, became completely silent after the breakup. Kurt stopped talking entirely. Days turned into weeks. The silence became unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kurt broke the silence. "You know," he said quietly, "I'm not always like this." "Oh, that's cool," Dave replied casually, but inside he was thinking, "Oh, thank God." Despite the awkward living situation and the uncomfortable silences, something magical was happening musically. Dave's addition to the band had sparked a legitimate chemical change in Nirvana's sound. They were practicing for hours, almost night, and everyone who saw them could sense it. Slim Moon, founder of the Kill Rock Stars label, would later say, "Kurt and Chris knew, and everybody else knew who saw them play, that they were only a hint of what they could be until Dave joined the band." Kurt had something new in mind for the next album. A subversion. He loved pop music, always had, but he wanted to disguise it, to hide catchy melodies inside walls of distortion and rage. In less talented hands, it could have been a disaster. In Kurt's hands, it would define a decade. "I've always liked music that sticks in your head and it's repetitive," Kurt explained in an interview. "I just can't follow music that's really technically busy and masturbatory. I've always liked simple music." The problem was that pop music had a reputation in the underground scene. It was seen as selling out, as compromising artistic integrity for commercial success. Kurt needed to find a way to write the catchiest songs of his career while maintaining his credibility with the punk rock community that had embraced Nirvana from the beginning. As Nirvana's reputation grew, the music industry took notice. Record labels began circling like sharks. Nirvana was wined and dined at expensive restaurants, meetings with executives who promised them the world. The band handled these meetings in their own unique way. Kurt would sit in near silence, wearily eating. Chris would get inappropriately drunk. Dave was the most talkative, but even he felt like they were snotty little hotshot kids, getting away with something. At one particularly memorable meeting with Capitol Records, they met a promotion man from Texas. "He looked like he would like to beat my mom up," Kurt said. "I just wanted to dance on top his desk with a dress on and piss all over the place." The executive asked Kurt about the song Polly. "So in that song, are you beating that bitch?" "Yes, I am," Kurt replied sarcastically. Then two radio programmers walked in with tickets to a Lakers game, and all three executives started cheering like frat boys. "We knew this wasn't the label for us," Kurt recalled. Eventually, Nirvana signed with Geffen Records, largely because of their success with Sonic Youth, another alternative band that had maintained their credibility while reaching a wider audience. But there was a waiting period. Geffen had to buy out Nirvana's contract with Sub Pop. Gold Mountain Management gave each band member about $1,000 a month to survive while they waited to record. It was during this cold, gray, depressing winter that Kurt Cobain began using heroin. In November 1990, during a phone call, Chris told Dave something that would change everything. "I got to tell you something. Kurt's been doing heroin." "What?" Dave said, shocked. "How did you find out?" "He told me," Chris replied. "Don't tell him that I told you." Kurt would tell Dave himself soon after. Dave tried to stay cool about it, asking casually what it was like. "It sucked," Kurt said. "It's stupid. It makes you feel gross and bad. I just wanted to try it." He promised he wouldn't do it again. Dave believed him. "It seemed so innocent," Dave would recall years later. "It seemed like a kid sticking a firecracker in a cat's butt and lighting it off for the hell of it. It didn't seem like anything at all. But it was something. It was the beginning of an addiction that would shadow Kurt for the rest of his life." Kurt himself would later describe that winter with Dave. "The whole winter that Dave and I spent together in that little apartment was the most depressing time I'd had in years. It was so small and dirty and cold and gray every day. I almost went insane at one point. I just couldn't handle it. I was so bored and so poor. We were signed to Geffen for months, and we didn't have any money. We ended up having to pawn our amps and our TV. all kinds of stuff, just to get money to eat corn dogs. It just felt really weird to be signed to this multi-million-dollar corporation and be totally dirt poor. All we did was practice. It was the only thing that saved us. Even that got repetitious after a while. During this dark period, Kurt became obsessed with a novel, Perfume: The Story of a Murderer, by Patrick Suskind. I've read Perfume about 10 times in my life, Kurt said. I can't stop reading it. It's like something that's just stationary in my pocket all the time. Every time I'm bored, like on an airplane, I read it over and over again. It just affects me, makes me want to cut my nose off. The novel tells the story of a perfume apprentice in 18th century France who possesses an extraordinary sense of smell, but has no scent of his own. He becomes disgusted with humanity and tries to isolate himself from all human contact. Eventually, he begins murdering young women to capture their scent and create the perfect perfume. When he finally creates this perfume and wears it, everyone becomes obsessed with him. But this acceptance brings him no peace, only more hatred for himself and humanity. The novel ends with him pouring the entire bottle on incest, causing people to literally tear him apart in a frenzy of desire. I can relate to that, Kurt said about the protagonist's desire to escape from people. The parallel was disturbing and prophetic. Kurt saw himself in this character, someone with extraordinary talent who felt fundamentally disconnected from humanity. Someone who discovered that success and acceptance could make you feel even more isolated than rejection ever did. On April 30th, 1991, Nirvana officially signed with Geffen Records. Kurt called his father Don with the good news. Don was so touched that he began to cry. It was a rare moment of connection between father and son. Recording was set to begin in just a few weeks. The producer chosen was Butch Vig, who had worked with Sub Pop, but had never produced an album for a major label. Nirvana had recorded demos with about a year earlier, and the band felt comfortable with his approach. Nirvana was to record at Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California. Chris and Shelley loaded their Volkswagen van with equipment and drove down. Kurt and Dave decided they too would drive, wanting to tourize the romance of a road trip. They set off in a beat-up Datsun, but the car overheated every 15 minutes. After 3 hours covering only 100 miles, they gave up, drove the car to a quarry, and pelted it with rocks for half an hour before returning to Chris's house and taking his reliable Dodge van instead. For the recording sessions, the band stayed at a furnished apartment complex called the Oakwood, near the studio, and it was here that a woman began visiting Kurt regularly. Her name was Courtney Love. They had first met in 1989 at a show in Portland. She looked like a classic punk rock chick, Kurt recalled. I did feel kind of attracted to her. Probably wanted to fuck her that night, but she left. Kurt had sat down next to her. They chatted, drank some beers, and he gave her some Nirvana stickers. I put them all in my suitcase, Courtney remembered. And I didn't even like his band. Courtney was far from a groupie. She had her own band, her own scene. When they met again in LA at a Butthole Surfers show, they began their courtship in a way that perfectly suited two dysfunctional punk rockers, by punching each other and wrestling. A mating ritual for dysfunctional people, Courtney called it. She seemed like poison, Kurt would recall. I'd just gotten out of a relationship I didn't even want to be in. I was determined to be a bachelor for a few months, but I knew that I liked Courtney so much right away that it was a really hard struggle to stay away from her for so many months. In May 1991, the recording sessions for Nevermind began in earnest. They started, naturally, with Smells Like Teen Spirit. The song had been born out of an incident with Kathleen Hanna, from Bikini Kill, who had drunkenly written "Kurt smells like teen seed" on his wall after a conversation about teenage rebellion. Kurt thought it was a poetic statement about youth and anarchy. He didn't know Teen Spirit was a deodorant brand. From the jump, Kurt envisioned Teen Spirit as the ultimate pop song. Butch Vig recalls. The riff was, as Vig described it, really stupid, a cross between Louie Louie and Boston's More Than a Feeling. But that's what made it magic. All the pop cliches were there. It transformed into something that sounded both familiar and completely new. They were like, "Hey Butch, what do you want us to play?" Vig remembers. I said, "Just play whatever you want. I'm just gonna listen and take notes." And they kicked into Teen Spirit. It just floored me how powerful it was. I remember getting up and pacing around the room going, "Oh my God, oh my God," watching Dave drum and listening to how incredibly powerful it sounded. When they finished, there was dead silence. Kurt looked at Vig and asked, "What do you think?" "Play it again," Vig said. "Play it again." Throughout the recording, Vig struggled to get Kurt to do multiple takes or double-track his vocals. Kurt resisted. Finally, Vig played his trump card. John Lennon did it. "Okay," Kurt would say, and do another take. Really, I had a hard time making Kurt or the band do things more than once. Vig recalls. A lot of times Kurt would go, "I don't feel like doing that right now." I could tell when I was pushing him too far. A couple of times he just put his guitar down or walked away from the mic and said, "I don't want to do it anymore." And I knew I wasn't going to get anything else out of him. They recorded in Bloom, Come As You Are, Breed, song after song, falling into place with surprising speed. Kurt's voice would get raw from singing at full intensity, and he'd coat his throat with codeine cough syrup. At this point, Kurt was already a heroin addict, and without a dealer in LA, the cough syrup served double duty, soothing his throat and feeding his addiction. Then came Lithium, and everything fell apart. The song was important to Kurt. It was based on his fascination with religion, possibly inspired by time he'd spent living with his friend Jesse Reed's born-again Christian parents. But something wasn't working in the studio. They started playing, and immediately the tempo began to speed up. Not badly, but enough that it felt wrong. Kurt noticed it. "What do we do?" he asked Vig. "I just don't like the way this is feeling." They tried 3 or 4 takes. Each one felt worse than the last. At the end of one take, Kurt didn't even finish the song. He just stopped. "Stop, stop, stop," he said. "This doesn't feel right to me." And then Kurt did something that Butch Vig had never seen before in all his years producing records. He launched into Endless Nameless. "I've never seen so much rage on a person's face," Vig recalls. It was scary. The tape was still rolling. Kurt played with complete abandon, screaming at the top of his lungs, attacking his guitar with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. At the end of the song, he completely smashed his left-handed Mustang guitar to pieces. When the dust settled, Vig stopped the tape. "Okay, guys. I guess let's call it today and pick up tomorrow." As Dave was leaving, Vig pulled him aside. "Have you ever played to a click track?" "No," Dave said. "Why?" "I think maybe we should try it on Lithium," Vig suggested. "It might help keep a steady groove." The next day, they set up Vig's small drum machine. Dave had never played to a click track in his life. They rolled tape on Lithium. First take. Boom. Done. Perfect. "I didn't have to do any drum editing," Vig marvels. "I was just like, oh my God, Dave Grohl is a machine." Years later, Dave would tell Vig something that broke his heart. "When you asked me to play with a click track, I broke my heart." The final song recorded for Nevermind was Something in the Way, and it turned out to be the hardest track on the album. After 3 or 4 takes trying to record it in the main studio room, it just wasn't happening. Kurt came into the control room, frustrated. He sat on the couch and said, "It needs to stow like this." He lay on his back and started playing the guitar, singing so quietly, it was almost a whisper. "Okay, stop, stop, stop," Vig said. He quickly grabbed a couple of microphones and plugged them in. He unplugged the phone. He turned off the fans in the tape machine. The room became completely silent. "This is it," Vig told Kurt. "Just do what you think you need to do right now." I literally held my breath for 3 minutes while he sang it. Vig remembers. It was so quiet, and yet it was so powerful, and that was the core of the track. The song was supposedly inspired by a period of homelessness Kurt experienced as a teenager. The legend says he lived under the Yonge Street Bridge in Aberdeen, though this has been disputed. He did hang out there and apparently ate fish from the river, leading to the line, "It's okay to eat fish, 'cause they don't have any feelings." but the song was as much fantasy as reality. Kurt spent about 4 months houseless, sleeping on porches and in hallways. The emotional truth of teenage isolation and alienation was more important than the literal facts. When the album was complete, everyone involved was proud and excited, but they tempered their expectations. Butch Vig thought it would be great to sell 500,000 copies. Initially, only 50,000 records were pressed. Within weeks, 300,000 were selling per week. Today, Nevermind has sold over 30 million copies worldwide. It's one of the best-selling albums of all time. More importantly, it changed everything. It killed the hair metal scene overnight. Every label suddenly wanted to sign a Nirvana clone. The sound, look, and attitude of grunge bled into mainstream culture. But there was a darker side to this success that nobody could have predicted. Kurt's favorite book had taught him a lesson he couldn't escape. Sometimes success doesn't bring happiness. Sometimes it only makes you sicker. The man who wrote Smells Like Teen Spirit, the ultimate pop song disguised as punk rock, would struggle with fame for the rest of his short life. The kid who lived in uncomfortable silence with Dave Grohl, too depressed to speak for weeks, created an album that would make him more famous than he ever wanted to be. Nevermind was supposed to sell maybe 500,000 copies to hardcore fans who understood what Nirvana was trying to do. Instead, it sold 30 million to people who often missed the point entirely, turning Kurt into exactly the kind of mainstream rock star he'd spent his whole life trying not to become. The album that was recorded in a few short weeks in the spring of 1991 would define a generation. But for Kurt Cobain, it would also become a prison he could never escape. Fortunately or unfortunately, there is only one Nirvana, Butch Vig would later say. The songs are so hooky. They have such a beautiful melodic sensibility, and Kurt's voice has a persona that draws you in. Kurt was very knowledgeable about art and books. He was very liberal and had a passion, almost a hatred for gay bashers, racists, and bullies, because he also felt like an outsider. He felt a kinship to the downtrodden people who were abused. I miss him. The story of Nevermind is the story of how a broken guitar, 3 minutes of rage, and a whispered song, recorded on a couch, created the most important rock album of the 1990s. But it's also the story of how success can destroy the very thing that made that success possible. Kurt Cobain wanted to reach people with his music. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and that success would ultimately contribute to his tragedy. If this story of how Nevermind changed music history moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the human cost of artistic success. What's your favorite song from Nevermind and why? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to ring that notification bell for more untold stories about the moments that changed rock and roll forever. Warning: this video contains dramatized elements for illustrative purposes. While inspired by actual events, documented interviews, and publicly available information, certain conversations and details are interpretive recreations. Follow us for more incredible stories about the moments that changed rock and roll forever.